The Consumer Bankers Association is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Mastering Identity Verification in an Omnichannel World, presented by AuthenticID. My name is Isabella, and it is my pleasure to facilitate today's event. Thank you for joining. Please note we are recording and all participant lines are muted. If you have any trouble, please send a message in the Q&A box or send an email to conferences@consumerbankers.com. This presentation will last up to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities at the end. You may submit a question at any time by entering the questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, the views expressed in this webinar are those of the presenters and do not represent the views of CBA or its members. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Blair Cohen, President and Founder of AuthenticID, Abhishek Sharma, Director, Identity and 3DS Product at TSYS, and Ed Deal, Principal TransUnion, TruValidate Global Fraud Solution at TransUnion. Blair, Abhishek, and Ed, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. We're happy to be here. Thanks to Consumer Banking Association for having us.
Yeah, so let's get started. We'll have a bit of a Q&A session today. So I have my first question here, which is for everyone. What fraud threats have been most prevalent in 2024 so far?
Oh my gosh, are we seeing a ton of this, folks? It's been in the news every day. It seems like we're talking about generative AI and synthetic identity. It is real. This is not just a bunch of hype. We're seeing a dramatic influx of both synthetic faces and synthetic documents. And some of the tools that are out there today are super good. They create very realistic looking images that will fool a human. So there is no way for a human. I'm an expert at this. I've been fighting fraud for over 30 years. And I can't tell the difference, folks, between a real person and a synthetically generated person. If I can't do it, you can bet that the people that are working the front lines for you in the banks and the telcos and that are looking at IDs and trying to determine whether they're real or not, they're getting fooled, because I get fooled every day. And what we're seeing a lot, and go to the next slide if you could, Isabella, is that the younger generation prefers to do commerce in person. They like to visit bank branches. So, surprising stat, I did a little research preparing for this webinar, and I found that Gen Zers go to their bank 6 times a month on average. 25% of Gen Zers talk to customer service agents live in the bank branch. They don't call customer service, they're going in live. 45% are depositing their paychecks into the bank physically versus, taking a picture and doing it the new way. So all the banks have been trying to get rid of branches for many, many years. We've got news for you. It's not happening anytime soon. The younger generation prefers that. JP Morgan Chase has opened up 650 branches over the past 2 or 3 years. It's been pretty phenomenal, and they've seen big dividends paid for that. 14% increase in revenues over the course of opening up those new branches. So that's what we're seeing. I'll let Abby and Ed, thank you both for being here, chime in on what they're seeing.
I'll go. This is Ed Deal. Thanks for having us on. I would definitely echo that synthetic fraud continues to be a real issue. It's something that's very hard to detect. I think that one of the things when you're fraud fighting and trying to detect synthetic fraud, a lot of times it's a holistic approach. So you want to look at the documents, you want to look at like device, all the data points that you can bring in will help you better target synthetic fraud, and then obviously the ongoing monitoring of it. Because one of the challenges that we've seen is that synthetic fraud, like once they actually get on your books, it'll take them a little while to bust out, and then you realize the loss, and then it becomes a credit loss, when maybe if there was more data points up front to stop it, you might have potentially avoided a loss, or maybe had some mitigation along the way where you could have done things like credit line decreases or or account closes based on review.
Couldn't agree more. It's a multi-pronged approach. You can't just have one signal and think you're good. You need a bunch of different signals in order to make the right decision up front. Abby, what are you guys seeing?
Absolutely. I echo what Blair and Ed have mentioned, and thanks Consumer Banking Association for this webinar. And I'm Abhishek Sharma. I'm the Director of Identity and 3DS Products within TSYS. Talking about the synthetic identity theft and synthetics entering in the system, something that has been an ongoing challenge for corporations and financial services specifically. The crucial aspect of synthetic identities entering in the system is that it's really tricky to and hard to detect synthetics, right? Once they are into the system. So I think it's imperative for corporations to have adequate methodologies and tools in place to detect synthetics at the very front end, right? In order to avoid fraudsters, right, performing malicious activities and making use of those identities. I mean, at the end of the day, the objective is to execute commerce, get into the system, get hold of the identities, right? Make money and do it on a recurring basis.
It's not one and done.
I know we have a poll question here for our audience to participate in, so I'm going to throw that up on the screen. Let me get that up for you guys. So we have our question here. What channel are you seeing the highest growth in fraud incidents? In branch, digital via website, digital via mobile app, or call centers? So I'll give you guys a little bit of time to get your answers in. Blair, Ed, Abhishek, any thoughts on what we might see?
Gosh, I have a prediction. Interested in hearing Abby and Ed's predictions. Abby, you go first.
Yeah, I would say since the surge of fraud from like couple of years ago, since pandemic, I would say digital via website is something that I would predict.
Okay. Ed, what do you think?
I mean, I still think that digital website, I still think that that's going to be I still think that that's going to be very prevalent, but I will say this, I do see a lot, like we're seeing more and more within the call centers, at least as a point of entry, like social engineering leading to account takeover and other things. So I see call center definitely on the rise, but I think digital would be prevalent.
Yeah, I'm going to be the contrarian here, and I'm going to go within branch just based on what we're seeing. I think it's one of the more vulnerable channels, if you will. Call centers certainly have tons of vulnerabilities, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. But in branch, you're talking about humans that are looking at all these signals, looking at the identity documents, and the sophistication of these documents has just gotten so good. I'm going to predict in branch. Can't wait to see what the audience thinks and what they're seeing.
So I'm going to close out the poll and we'll see what people answered.
I was way wrong. Abby, you nailed it. Abby and Ed, good for you. Digital via website. Okay.
All right, let's move on. So Blair, I'm gonna look over to you once again. So let's start talking about fraud in person at branches. Blair, what are the biggest challenges from an authentication standpoint?
Yeah, I think I've alluded to it and kind of spoken to it already. It's just the sophistication of these identity documents. People are super bold and they're willing to walk in and fool a branch teller. They're willing to walk in and fool a telco. I'll just give you a stat. We do document authentication for most of the North American telecommunications companies. Just one of those last year, we intercepted 420 something thousand fake IDs and 60,000 repeat offenders that were on their banned customer list in 1 year. It saved them about over $500 million. And the majority of that was in branch. So that's a big vulnerability. And I think people need to start paying attention to it. We've seen a huge rise in check fraud, same vulnerability. You walk in with a fake ID, the human behind the counter can't tell the difference. They're just too good these days, folks.
Thanks, Blair. And then Ed, I'm gonna turn it over to you and ask you a question. So in the digital channel, how can we leverage information gathered from a person's device during a mobile-based interaction? And what are some of those signals that we can use to flag suspicious behavior?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I mean, right now, I mean, from what we've seen right now, like new account opening fraud is still like probably the highest percentage of digital fraud that we see, followed by like account takeover, right? But like what the biggest thing we want is it's going to be going back to think more data, the more data that you have. So when you look at things like device reputation, you know, you'll look at things like IP. Are there any IP anomalies? You know, are they coming in from a proxy? Are they coming in from like, you know, a Tor network, you know, trying to obfuscate where their device is? Are they against any reputation lists? So, you know, like, do you have access to a device consortium where users are placing fraud evidence and fraud types in there to see that that device in there has been associated with fraud? Linkages are also really important. You know, like example, like, you know, an account, you know, somebody comes in online and they try to open up 4 accounts in a half hour from the same device. It's those type of things. Bot detection. So now we start getting into more like what I would say like behavioral, like you can see some, you know, some triggers there with velocity, but really like with bot detection, like the behavioral analytics part, like if someone's filling out a new application, you know, if it takes somebody normally about a minute to go from, you know, put a social, a date of birth, an address, and a name in, but they're doing it in like in 10 seconds, that could be indicative of bot type activity. And then also too, trying to tie that device back to a person, you know, so that's really important. And all this is really perpetrated by, you know, we want a good online experience. If someone provides an online experience that puts too much friction up against good people, they're just going to move on to the next financial institution and open up an account. Same thing with the account, same thing in the account management cycle where people log in. I mean, people are logging in every day to look at their account. They're logging in to move money. They may be making changes to their profile. And that ease of access allows for more fraud touch points that could occur. So being able to confidently pair that device to that person in that digital space is something that's really paramount as more and more fraud shifted. It used to be in financial services. I mean, we probably have all heard it. It used to be, it was really easy to make a counterfeit credit card. Then when we had the chip and the pin came out in the US, then everything moved to really like new account opening fraud, card not present, and then we're looking at things like account takeover where that shifted. So I think using all those data points, and then I would add in too, it can be scores, it can be rule based. But I would also say that storing that data and then going back and looking how that actually performs will help you achieve the balance of, you know, putting up friction where you need to put friction, but also stopping fraud and keeping a good customer experience.
Thanks, Ed. And then Avi, I wanted to ask you, what are the fraud vulnerabilities in the online payment sector and what can be done to mitigate these threats?
Absolutely. So I mean, the goal of fraudsters is to, as I alluded, is to get hold of the account, do commerce, right? Make transactions, and then do it on a repetitive manner, right? So there are a number of vulnerabilities in the online payment sector. If you consider e-commerce or or users needing to transact over digital channels, whether it's web-based or mobile or smart device-based. There are some of the prevalent threats, right? Like phishing attacks or social engineering, So whether it's Valentine's Day at the beginning of the year or Thanksgiving towards the end of the year, I mean, it's everywhere, right? There's a surge, there's a cycle of fraud, right? Happening throughout the year. And then every now and then we hear about data breaches and malware used on websites or digital channels, and any system or application vulnerabilities. So all these lead to fraudsters getting hold of the account, luring customers and cardholders to entering information, right? Getting hold of their payment information and using that for conducting commerce. The top four threats that you see on the slide, according to a recent study, compared to 2023, we've seen double-digit growth in these, right? So when we talk about first-party fraud, right, merchants especially are getting a lot of hit from first-party fraud, right? Whether it's fraudulent returns or stolen is used for transactions, or some sort of a return fraud or friendly fraud, right? So that's hitting quite a bit, the current scenario. Triangulation fraud scheme is one of the very innovative methods, right? Fraudsters have adopted in the last few years, where goods are bought with stolen credit cards and they are sold on legitimate merchant sites and marketplaces. And then consumers like us, right? We buy those goods as well. So it's like a kind of completes a cycle, but it's something that's really hard to detect, right? So there has to be some sort of a linkage between merchants and issuers, right? To basically connect the dots and figure out. Account takeover over fraud, again, high double-digit growth seen from last year, something that's happening across channels. So, right, whether it's digital channels or whether it's fraudsters that know some information of customers and they now want to get into accounts, so they either call the call center, right, to manage or update information, receive OTPs, right, things like that. So corporations need to have adequate fraud detection in place, right, across channels to detect and mitigate account takeover fraud. Loyalty fraud is again something that has emerged. It's still going up, as I mentioned. During pandemic, there were a number of instances where fraudsters did flight bookings and then canceled, and they were getting cash or checks in mail. It's a huge problem, especially for corporations that have high-profile clients, right? That have transactions involving high dollar value as well, right? That's kind of the cream for fraudsters as well. So loyalty fraud and then identity theft. I know Blair and Ed alluded to that as well. Again, all these top types of fraud or threats that corporations are facing most of them are pretty hard to detect. So it's really important for financial institutions and corporations to have adequate guardrails and fraud detection methodologies in place. So in terms of best practices for mitigating fraud, so again, the panelists they, have alluded to that before. Things like device fingerprinting or linking with customers, right, with cardholders, and using that for authentication purposes is a best practice that's followed across organizations and companies in the financial services and payment space. you will come across things like smart friction, right? And where to use it, how to use it to strike a balance between user experience and adequate fraud protection or fraud detection. So that's where elements of passive authentication comes into play, where corporations can use right methodologies and technologies to monitor and track user behaviors, right? It's something that we are also advising clients to implement at the very beginning of the value chain, so that instead of spending a lot of money on having a number of fraud checks or risk assessments throughout the life cycle, it's I mean, behavioral analytics provides the adequate sort of fraud detection at the very outset, right, where you can easily either implement a JavaScript or an SDK over digital channels to gather user or consumer behaviors and then make a decision based on that. So it's something that consumers won't. I mean, it's transparent to them, and is a good way. It's a pretty strong way to authenticate passively. And in terms of voice channels or call center channels, voice recognition is something that is going to be really key, especially in this age where we are. We have prevalent deep fakes, right, and all sorts of cutting edge technologies used by fraudsters, right? So having adequate technologies and detection capabilities for the voice channel is going to be key as well. The other point I want to mention is that OTP is something that's going to be a thing of the past very soon. I mean, everyone knows that fraudsters have found ways to go around the OTP-based authentication, right? Generate a random number, or get the OTP themselves. So typically, what we've seen is that banks have some sort of a fraud detection or risk assessment for attached to the phone number, right, where they can get real-time information from mobile network operators, and then be that if the number looks in a healthy condition. That's still better than a bare-bone OTP-based authentication, but I think there are far superior technologies like an instant link, right, to do the location of the user, exchange tokens with the MNOs. That way, I mean, again, that's part of the smart friction aspect that we'll be talking about. Is that we need to reduce the number of steps users and consumers take for completing a transaction or an activity. And then lastly, having adequate methodologies to detect potential fraud patterns. So that's something corporations need to do on a continuous basis. Have a risk-based approach, right? Using a risk engine or an analytics engine does not, if there is a rules system, or we use some sort of machine learning models, but that's something that needs to be done on a continuous basis to ensure that potential fraud patterns are detected and there are methodologies in place to authenticate users.
Thank you, Abhi. And then I did want to kind of turn it over and talk about something that was slightly mentioned earlier in the webinar. So another important channel not to overlook is call centers, as they're often considered an easy target for fraudsters. Ed, what specific vulnerabilities exist within call center operations that make them susceptible to identity-based fraud?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's going to go back to some of like what we talked a little bit about device. I mean, some of what happens right now is like if you have a phone number that you have authenticated, you know, previously with the financial institution, you're typically going to go right through maybe to an IVR and be able to perform transactions based on that authentication. You know, some of the riskier transactions might go to a call, might actually go to an agent. And what happens there is there's the potential for social engineering that could occur. Okay, so we think, and what we've seen, and this isn't a stat that was published in here, but it was published last year from us that, you know, it used to be account takeover was primarily around, you know, someone logging in, getting your username and password, going into breaking into someone's account and moving money and changing, you know, PI, you know, changing, you know, preferences and things of that nature. But it really has kind of closed the gap a little bit. It was almost 50-50 like a year ago in our study. Now, what happens is this becomes you know, a pre-crime. So they'll gain information, and so it becomes a real problem. So they can down the road perpetrate with the information that they gain from a call center agent. So one of the best ways is like Abby had just referred to it before, but you know, when you have a phone number that's coming in, having phone number intelligence, like, you know, did a SIM swap occur? Was there recently a carrier change or porting? You know, were we looking at, you know, does the phone even match the name? You know, things of that nature. That'll allow you to make smarter decisions relative to what you're going to do in the call center as far as authentication. The inbound call that comes in, you get that phone number intelligence, and you can see whether or not there's the likelihood of a phone takeover risk based on some of the factors that I had just mentioned. So that would be a smarter way to try to defend against it there. And then you can kind of see on the right that overall, you know, the national average was about, you know, for all area codes is about 4.5%. But there are a couple that really stand out, including my own area around Philadelphia, but Western Maryland, where there's a lot more fraud coming from those area codes. I don't know exactly why, but that's what I would say there. It's really around the social engineering aspect. And if they're able to get through and initiate transactions online with a call center agent, like where we'll show later where they can actually move money, you know, where they're sending out if they're sending out a one-time passcode and there's no intelligence placed in that, where maybe they're just matching the name to the phone number. But, you know, but what could happen is that phone number could have been, you know, it could be ported. It could be, you know, it could be changed to another carrier. So those are the things that become risky, and being smarter about that, using that route and helping to authenticate transactions. Okay. So this is just an example here that a study that was performed. Well, really, it's a fraud incident that occurred that it encompassed 3 deceased victims. So a lot of times what we've seen is that it does start out with the phone being taken over, because that is an authentication method, you know, for a lot of financial institutions. And in this case here, you could see that, you know, the same financial institution was targeted twice, once in the website and once in the call center. So I think one of the points here is that, you know, making sure that when you have omni-channel, you know, the story here, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, every channel is talking to each other. You know, like, was there measures in place where if they went to the website first and then they transferred, you know, this X amount of money, and then they come back to the call center and do the same thing, like, you know, having that synced up is something that's really quite important. But in here, you know, a lot of these, when we ran, when the analysis was run, you can see that like there were different points of influence that we could see where the phone was taken over. Like some of those underlying risk signals that I alluded to earlier would stop a one-time passcode from going out, and then ultimately not having a money transfer occur. So that's kind of like the key takeaways. And again, in this case here, it was 3 victims. They were deceased victims that had forgotten to close, you know, they didn't know to close their accounts because they were recently deceased. And you could see, you know, where the phone was taken over. You know, they were able to pass the knowledge-based authentication questions because they had the PII, the personally identifiable information, to answer the questions. But, you know, building in smarter tactics before a transaction would occur, or whether before sending a one-time passcode, yeah, you would be able to thwart that and see that there were some anomalies with that phone before they would have been sent out to allow the transaction to complete.
Amazing story.
Thanks, Ed. And then we do have another poll question here that I wanted to share with the audience. So I'm gonna get that up for everyone. So we'll give people some time to respond to this, but the question is, what tactics are you using within your organizations to fight fraud? So you may need to scroll down a bit to look at all the answers depending on how it pops up on your screen, but we'll give people some time. Did our speakers have any thoughts on this while people continue to answer?
Goodness, I'll go first. I think I was so bad with my last answers. I hope I can redeem myself this time around. This is a tough one, though, because all of these signals are valid and good signals to ingest, and they all yield some benefits towards fighting fraud. Gosh, I'm going to go with what we do, ID verification technology, just to my biased self. Abby, you're next.
Yeah, I agree with Blair. I mean, these are methodologies in several areas that are important from an overall ID verification and authentication perspective. So I would, that's important to, I think, to organizations to fight fraud. I would go with ID verification technology as well.
Oh, I hope we're right. Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I actually I think I'm in both of your corner with the ID verification technology, and I think a lot of it where it swings back for me is that when we talk about the in-branch portion of it, you know, like that's the part that would kind of sway me here with that. But I mean, again, I would probably say followed by device-based risk signals. You know what I mean? If there's a way to pair those up, that's also a good way to have more data points. But in this case here, where we're talking about like multiple channels and all, I would absolutely say that identity verification technology is probably at the forefront for me.
Great. I'll end the poll and we'll see what people shared.
It's right there at the top. Super encouraged to see that biometric authentication scored so highly in this poll. There's been a lot of reticence towards adopting biometric authentication, but to me, it's the perfect balance of fraud prevention versus customer experience, if you will. Generally, with fraud prevention, we have to erect all these hurdles that a fraudster or consumer needs to hop through. But with biometric authentication, it's as simple as opening up your iPhone, and we have real evidence as to who performed a transaction. You know, you mentioned earlier that first-party fraud was a big problem, Abby. With biometric authentication, it's going to be really hard to say, I didn't do it. That big screen TV didn't get shipped to my house when we've got a picture of you accepting it. So anyway, encouraged by that.
We'll move on. And Blair, I'm going to turn it back over to you. So what are the latest advancements in identity verification technology and how do they contribute to the fraud we have been discussing today?
They contribute pretty greatly. As you can see, this is a very, very difficult science. Being able to forensically analyze an identity document isn't easy. Certainly humans can't do it. So if a human were to look at an identity document, and humans are also, by the way, pretty terrible at matching the person in front of them to a headshot on an identity document. They get that wrong. Trained professionals about 40% of the time. So you can see that we throw a lot of different algorithms at every analysis that we performed. I think we performed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500 different tests on every ID that we see in a fully automated way. Everything from making sure that it's a real identity document. We see tons of websites out there that have perfect templates for name a state, name a country, name an identity document type. You can go get a perfect template at thousands of different websites out there, but it's not a real identity document, right? It's a perfect template, but has to be displayed on a computer screen or has to be printed out and then laminated. We're able to stop that fraud vector, but cutting to the chase and tying in my earlier comments about generative AI, what we're seeing is a couple of different things that are new and different. I've been doing this for about 30 years, and the level of sophistication has increased pretty dramatically over the past 30 years. We're seeing velocity. So we're seeing the same identity document go from one telecommunications store to another, to another, to another, all within an hour and a half, with their main goal of just going and buying as many handsets as they can. They commit credit suicide. These are real identity documents in many, many cases. But because of this unusual velocity, it's not normal for somebody to go to an AT&T store and buy 3 phones, and go to a Verizon store and buy 3 phones, and go to a T-Mobile store and buy 3 phones all within an hour. That's very unusual. Because all these people scan identity documents, we're able to see that velocity in real time and throw alerts. So they might get away for the first time, but the second time we're going to throw an alert that says we've seen this document in an unusual velocity. So we've put a lot of effort and time into velocity checks, not just on the document. We go deeper. We look at the device, for example. Ed's talked about that a lot. And then the other thing that we're seeing with great frequency is something fairly sophisticated. So they're taking these generative AI images, these synthetic documents, synthetic faces. We're going to stop that every time using all of this stuff on the bottom row in orange. If they use our capture, and if they use all of our flows, we're going to know if it's a real identity document. We know if it's a real person at the end of a transaction. We're not going to get fooled by that. Where there are some vulnerabilities, though, is the bottom right, deepfake injection attacks. And we are certainly seeing a fair amount of injection attacks lately. And those are super tough and super hard to stop. Because the signals that we get from the camera sensor that tell us whether a person was alive or not, or whether it was a spoof attempt of any sort, are bypassed, and they're injected into the flow. So we're working very, very hard on that. We've got a ton of new algorithms out that will detect those things with a great deal of accuracy. So that's kind of what we're seeing, Isabella.
Thanks, Blair. And then we can move back on to Abhi. I'm going to call on you again. So many banks have soiled approach to identity verification across different channels. Could you discuss the drawbacks of this and why a more unified approach across various channels, including in-store, online, and call centers, is ideal?
Absolutely. Yes. So yeah, what we don't want today is our operations, right, in silos, right? We want systems and channels to talk to each other. We want corporations to be able to make great use of the data, right? Because every financial institution, every corporation has tons and tons of data, right? If there is an activity done on a digital channel, there has to be the technology should be able to link to what is happening at this call center, right? The activity that happened at the call center, or if there was a redemption activity done over another digital channel, or a transaction was attempted, right, online. So yeah, I mean, silos are not good for right, the way the technology is progressing. And then the key for this is to have a complete picture of a user, right from the time when they applied for credit or a payment form factor. Every organization gets a ton of data when they see a user coming in applying for credit for the first time, including the standard PII. There should be some strong ways of authentication, like ID verification being that should be done at the very outset, because organization don't know who the person is, whether it's a synthetic form of identity or if it's legitimate legitimate user applying for credit. So it starts from there, and then once the user gets an account, gets a payment form factor, gets into the system, now they'll start doing activities, right? Build a profile, enter contact information, get their payments form factors, right? Either card or an account, or some sort of a digital wallet based payment form factor. And then users will, or cardholders will start interacting by calling call center or redeeming rewards or doing transactions. So so the need at the R is to create a user profile that has data connectedness, right? So I think a machine learning or risk engine based orchestration that gathers user touch points from various use cases and channels, I think it's an ideal approach to aggregating data and information about a user, and then using that on a recurring basis for identifying the user if there's a subsequent activity or a new activity that comes in. For example, I open an account at Bank A. My application is approved, and then I start transferring funds, right? I start using a credit card for online purchases. So the system should enable gathering all those touch points, all the data for efficient fraud detection as needed. And then again, employing adequate authentication methodologies, whether it's a possession element, right? What Ed mentioned for ensuring that the devices are attached, they are fingerprinted, and known devices attached to users, that risk assessment is performed on a continuous basis, or using some sort of push authentication or based method. I think that helps as well for authenticating users across channels. One of the benefits of having a unified approach is also from a cost perspective to corporations, where they don't have to, corporations don't need to implement methodologies and tools in separate channels or businesses, right? If there is a centralized system for risk assessment, segregation of data, detecting fraud, and enabling authentication, it is easier to maintain, easier to plug in new services, and with the data connectedness, it is more efficient and seamless for end users as well.
Thanks, Abhi. And then I do have one more follow-up question on that. So what are some best practices for striking the right balance between robust identity verification measures and providing a smart friction experience for customers across different channels?
Yeah, I know this slide has a lot of text, but the bottom line is to have um, to monitor fraud, right, and keep reviewing and updating fraud patterns on a regular basis is going to be the key in the future as well, since corporations now have to keep pace or be ahead of the technologies that are adopted by fraudsters these days, right? With deep fakes and new methods of spoofing information and creating synthetic identities as well. Keeping a track and closely monitoring statistics, fraud patterns coming up, getting feedback from customers and clients is the key as well, right? Because that leads into updating fraud models and patterns as well. One of the key aspects, and folks have been asking as well, is how do we strike the balance between adequate identity verification methods and user experience? So several years ago, right when there was pandemic around the corner, where the digital use of digital channels was increasing as well, corporations used to implement a lot of fraud detection, risk assessment methods at the very upfront, right, which used to load up the system and the user journey as well. I think we are at a stage where there are technologies like behavioral based authentication that can be implemented upfront to continuously gather user behavior, and based on the risks that were that are identified or determined, there can be additional methods used as well, right? Whether it's a step up right from then on, or introducing some strong ways. So right, so for use cases like account onboarding, right, it's pretty important to have some strong authentication methods, like use of biometrics or document verification to ensure, especially if there are potential risks identified, right? So it's important to use these technologies, as Blair and Ed alluded to earlier. Again, use of some intuitive step-up methods, like push-based methods, where it's user just need on their phone, click on their desktop. It's something that has a better user experience compared to entering a 6 or 8 digit code, right? And also there are various methods, right, of just clicking on a link, right, and exchanging tokens in the background. So that's something that can be used as well, right? Again, depending on use cases and the amount of friction that organizations would want to introduce as well. Again, I mean, I would, to summarize, I would say that corporations do need to closely monitor the systems, right? Closely monitor fraud patterns and keep updating on a regular basis, and also um, um, build systems in a way that these identity verification systems or methodologies, they talk to fraud systems as well, right? Also, for it's a very good experience and preferable from a user experience perspective as well, that if a user is stuck, right, or cannot execute an activity or a transaction, that agents have enough information to assist consumers. So identity systems talking to fraud systems, and then feeding data so that models can be refined, right? Systems know what decisioning has been made as well.
Thanks so much, Abhi. And then we did get a question from the audience. Again, if anyone has any questions or comments, please place them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them during our last 10 minutes. But we did get a question. Are you concerned that legislative and regulatory action regarding consumer privacy rights could make it more difficult to get the data needed to identify consumers? Blair, you're on mute.
Need to unmute. Yeah, I'll take that one first. Yeah, Jeff, I'm absolutely concerned that the privacy rights, the regulatory environment is not conducive to gathering all the signals that we need in order to make accurate decisions on whether a person is who they say they are and whether their intent is malicious or not. There is some hope. There is. The problem that we have now is that all of these regulations are siloed, kind of like the banks operate. We have them in Baltimore, we have them in Portland, we have them across the entire state of Illinois, and many states are considering further regulation on the data. There is some hope, though. There is federal legislation, a federal act introduced by, I think it was Maria Cantwell in Washington, Senator Cantwell, the American Privacy Rights Act. And there is hope that we can get a streamlined set of rules that work for all of us throughout, no matter what state or city you live in. And all of these things really rely on consent. So you have the option. If you're a good person and you want to consent and make it okay for people to use your data, then you can, and you can have the easy path in a lot of cases, the happy path. Fraudsters are probably never going to consent to have their data and their biometrics and those kind of things reused. So we're still going to have this problem. I don't think fraud's going to go away, but there is hope that we can have one set of rules that we all have to abide by, regardless of the city or state that you live in. Ed and Abby, I'm sure you guys have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, I mean, I do like the idea of the standardization, from our end. I do like that a lot. You know, there should be some rigor around it, but like as far as having like the federal override like state type of privacy laws. I think it's just much easier to implement things, especially when like financial institutions are in different states and people are applying in different areas and all. And having one set of standards that could supersede that can certainly help out in that whole process. With there's the fraud will still be there, but like the what data that you can collect and so on to make good decisions. I like the standardization approach just for that reason alone, that banks are doing business in multiple states and they have to adhere to different policies based on that state. It's my thought.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. Standardization is the key as well. But I would really hope for the regulation in the US to be as nicely aligned or be streamlined as what we see in other parts of the world as well, right? Especially EU, where there is pretty uniform guidelines and regulation policies as well. As Blair mentioned, there has to be, or there will be an element of consent, right, which would enable corporations to implement, right, use user data, consumer identity data, and use for several purposes, right? Fraud detection and authentication being one of them. So.
Thanks, guys. So I don't know if we have any more questions that have come in. Give people a couple more minutes. So we are approaching the end of the webinar. So I did want to ask you all if you have any parting recommendations on what FIs can do to be better at fraud fires through identity verification.
There's so much that people need to do. Pay attention to your branches. I think that because we had people reviewing these things, we thought that we weren't susceptible and vulnerable to fraud in branch, that threat was more in the digital channel or the call center channel. That's really not the case, folks. The branches are being attacked. They're being attacked every single day. We see well over 2,000 fake IDs every single day, just in the telecommunications arena alone. So don't rely on humans to process all these signals. Put some automation in place, put some real rigor in your analysis, make the smart decision up front. Behavioral biometrics, we've heard Abby talk about those a fair amount. The challenge with all biometrics is you've got to get the first mile right. We need to know who that person is before we start learning that this device is asserted that it belongs to Blair Cohen when it's really belonging to a fraudster. So get the identity verification piece right up front. Then the rest of these tools can be just icing on the cake.
I can kind of go. I mean, much like what we talked about earlier, and probably the theme of this webinar is really around omni-channel. So having all the channels kind of talking to each other, having good unified strategies where everybody's talking, collecting as much data up front, regardless of the channel that's coming in, so you can kind of avoid the fraud on the back end. The other thing that I probably would see, and it's probably based on my past experiences, is just, as new, as you're trying to acquire new customers or open up new services and all, and working with like the product managers within your own financial institutions, making sure that you have a seat at the table, with them, so you can kind of craft out some of the some of the risky points that may occur as we open up ease of access or ease of application.
Yeah, and yeah, I would totally agree with Blair and Ed's comments. I mean, I would say in today's world, data is gold, right? Every other big or small corporation is sitting on a ton of data. So it's our sort of, I mean, it's our strength, it's corporation's strength to make use of that data effectively, right? Connect the dots, right? So that systems and products, they talk to each other, right? They and then collaborate with organizations as well, right? I mean, most of the data that we use today, right, across industries is also driven by consortium, right, where organizations contribute, and it's used for a common purpose of sharing information, used for fraud detection, and mitigation. So I think that's going to be the key as well. And then have system in place, right? The technology has advanced so much. Have a technology that can detect, right, and have enablements to keep updating fraudulent patterns as well, to basically be ahead of fraudsters in this industry. So those would be my parting comments.
Thank you so much, guys. So we have 2 minutes left of the hour. So unless anyone has anything to add, I don't believe we have any other questions that came in. We can wrap it up. So thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you, Blair, Ed, and Abhi, for joining us today. Again, thank you, AuthenticID, for sponsoring today's webinar. And thank you to all of our participants. The session has been recorded. It will be available within 1 to 2 business days. On behalf of CBA, thank you so much for joining, and have a great afternoon. You may now disconnect.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.